Well, the resurrection that was promised last week came tonight at the state capitol in Tennessee.
They tried to kill hope and love, but resurrection is always guaranteed after persecution.
That was Tennessee Representative Justin J. Pearson, who will be our first guest tonight. Today, Mr. Pearson's partner in expulsion from the Tennessee House, Representative Justin Jones, was resurrected as a member of the legislature when local officials in his district, following the procedure for filling a vacancy in the legislature, voted to fill the vacancy created by Justin Jones' expulsion by Republicans from the legislature with Justin Jones. Justin Jones was then sworn in as a member of the legislature, which was followed by Representative Justin Jones' truly triumphant return to the House of Representatives, while the Republican members of that House watched in humiliation and possibly rage. Local officials in Justin Pearson's district are expected to meet Wednesday to vote to send him back to the House of Representatives and thus complete the triumphant return of the only two members of the Tennessee House of Representatives to be expelled because of what the Republicans in the House called a violation of decorum. After not being allowed to speak on the House floor about the latest mass murder in a Tennessee school in which 3 educators and 3 9-year-old children were murdered, Representatives Pearson, Jones, and Gloria Johnson went to the floor of the House with a megaphone during a recess to respond to and encourage student protesters in the galleries who were protesting the Republican legislature's refusal to do anything about mass murder in Tennessee, including access to the AR-15, which was used in that school shooting in Tennessee and was used again today in Kentucky. Today's mass murder in Kentucky was someone who would pass any background check for purchasing firearms that exists anywhere in America. Background checks do not prevent first-time murderers from buying their first weapons of murder, buying their first AR-15s. A 25-year-old man working at a bank in Louisville, Kentucky, showed up at work today with an AR-15 and shot and murdered 5 people working at the bank, including his bosses. He was a high school basketball star, a graduate of the University of Alabama, and a banker. So you can add that to the profile of people who should not be allowed to purchase AR-15s, which is to say, everyone. The only thing that can prevent a person like that legally purchasing an AR-15 is to make the sale of the AR-15 illegal, the way it was for 10 years after Senator Joe Biden passed a law banning the sale of assault weapons in the 1990s. That law stayed in effect for 10 years until Republican President George W. Bush and the Republican-controlled Congress deliberately refused to extend the life of that law. And in the process, those Republicans have ended lives because George W. Bush and the Republican Congress and Republican legislators in state legislatures in Tennessee and Kentucky have done everything they possibly can to make sure that America's mass murderers are the very best equipped mass murderers in the world. There's nothing more they could possibly do. If mass murderers had a lobby, they would have nothing to ask for because Republicans have given them every law they could possibly want in order to easily purchase AR-15s and kill as many people as they possibly can before, as happened today, the police kill the mass murderer. We don't know if any Democrats in the Kentucky state legislature across the border from Tennessee will be expelled this week or next week because they protest inaction by Republican legislators. But we can be absolutely sure that the Republicans in the Kentucky legislature will do absolutely nothing to stop the next mass murderer from legally purchasing an AR-15 in Kentucky. Am I next? That's what children protesting mass murders of their classmates around the country are asking. Am I next? And tonight, local bank managers and bank tellers can ask themselves, am I next? Anyone in an American movie theater can ask, am I next? Anyone in a shopping mall, anyone in a church. It doesn't matter where you are or where you go. You could be next. And Republicans insist that's the way it should be. I am a man. That was the rallying cry in Tennessee in 1968 that brought the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to Tennessee to support the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis after two sanitation workers, Robert Walker and Ethel Cole, were killed on the job. The workers who collected the trash from the street and threw it into the trucks were not allowed to ride inside the trucks, even when it was raining. In the rain, those workers took shelter by sitting inside that huge scoop at the back of the trash trucks. And when the compressor on their truck suddenly malfunctioned, Robert Walker and Ethel Cole, sheltering from the rain in the scoop, were dragged into the innards of the truck with the garbage. Robert Walker and Ethel Cole were swallowed, broken up, and crushed to death in the trash inside that truck. All of their co-workers walked off the job and demanded the right to join a union. Their protest slogan was simply, I am a man. That was what brought Dr. King to Memphis for what turned out to be the final speech of his life. The mayor of Memphis then got a court-ordered injunction to forbid Dr. King from leading a protest march in Memphis. The right-wing conservatives of Tennessee used a legal process to try to silence Martin Luther King. Exactly what right-wing conservatives are still trying to do in Tennessee, as we saw last week. Dr. King said that the injunction against the protest march was something that he would expect from the totalitarian governments in China and Russia at the time. To a packed audience inside the Mason Temple in Memphis the night before he was assassinated, Dr. King said, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land, and I am happy. I am so happy tonight. Those were the last words publicly spoken by Martin Luther King. Last week, this country heard the very first words spoken by our next guest that went national, that had the reach of Martin Luther King's speeches, reached beyond Tennessee, words that were heard in every corner of this nation. People who heard Dr. King speak have told me that what they heard last week from Representative Jones and Representative Pearson were voices like Dr. King's, voices that can lead this country through the darkest days with hope.
This week especially, Holy Week, we remember also Dr. King and the forebearers of the civil rights movement who taught us about civil disobedience as a way to get action. Dr. King taught us that sometimes there's a consciousness above rule, above what you might say is law, and that the true forms of protest is nonviolent disobedience. For less than a few minutes, we and you are seeking to expel District 86's representation from this House. in a country that was built on a protest. In a country that was built on a protest. You who celebrate July 4th, 1776, pop fireworks and eat hot dogs. You say to protest is wrong because you spoke out of turn, because you spoke up for people who are marginalized. You spoke up for children who won't ever be able to speak again. You spoke up for parents who don't want to live in fear. You spoke up for Larry Thorne, who was murdered by gun violence. You spoke up for people that we don't want to care about. In a country built on people who speak out of turn, who spoke out of turn, who fought out of turn to build a nation. I come from a long line of people who have resisted. I come from a long line of people who have fought injustice. I come from a long line of people who know what it means to face adversity in difficult days. We all have a responsibility. We all have an obligation to do what is just, to do what is right, and to do what is fair. And what I can promise to those of you who have cried today, those of you who mourn the seeming end and assault on our democracy, what I can say to folks who are worried about whether or not, as one sign said, am I next? What I can say to you is that the movement for justice can never die, because the heart for justice can never be killed, because it lives and it beats in each and every one of us. It cannot die because we will not let it die. I'll tell you that folks have tried to kill it. They tried to put it on a tree called Calvary. They tried to kill hope and love, but resurrection is always guaranteed after persecution.